We are going to now apply this disaggregation to the recent history of our debt to see what are the factors that have been moving the debt around. Starting with the period where we accumulated debt. 1996 to 2003, the period of debt accumulation. The numbers on the chart show the contribution to the debt by each of these components measured as percentage points of GDP. So therefore, during the 7 years between 1996 and 2003, the government's housekeeping balance was in surplus every single one of those years. That is, the government earned more revenue from taxation than it spent for programs and wages and salaries. It's a regular expenditure, so to speak. So, were it just for the housekeeping balance alone, the debt to GDP ratio would have contracted by 6 percentage points per year on average during that period. The doubling of our debt to GDP ratio during those years was therefore not due to excessive government expenditure. That's sort of myth number one crossed out. Since public investment pretty much always has to be financed, as I indicated, then public investment is always going to be an addition to your debt. It turns out that there wasn't very much public investment taking place during that period. So that contributed, on average, only 1 percentage point to our accumulation of debt during that period. I'm going to skip over the big kahuna and look at another surprising result, which is interest payments. If we take out the effect of inflation, it turns out that interest on the debt we were accumulating itself was a small contributor. That is to say, most of the interest rate could have been paid out of revenues that were coming in just because of inflation. So that was a small factor. And there seemed to have been very little revaluation of the debt due to exchange rate movements and the like during the period. It turns out that all of the debt accumulation can be explained by the government having had to assume liabilities and obligations that were contracted outside of central government. 13 percentage points of debt per year. That means that were it not for the housekeeping surplus, the debt would have accumulated almost twice as fast as we did during that period. Now, most of this is actually FinSac, the banking crisis debts that were brought onto the government's books in 2001. But FinSac is not the only one. Hint. But there are lots of them. Water Commission, Sugar Industry Authority, University of the West Indies. But those were the factors that were at work in the period of debt accumulation. Now we're going to do the same analysis for the period subsequent to that when the debt contracted. What we're trying to explain here is a contraction of debt to GDP that averaged about 3% per year between 2004 and 2008. And those refer to fiscal years. So it's fiscal year 2004 to 5 and fiscal year 2008 to 9. And the surprising thing about that decomposition is how similar it looks to the period of debt accumulation. The pattern of this graph is pretty much the same. We're still running big housekeeping surpluses, except now even bigger. The other items are all relatively small. And even though there is no FinSac debt between 2004 and 2008, the contribution of public enterprises, off-budget events, to the debt continues to be a significant item. It turns out that the only reason, well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why the debt managed to be coming down during this period, despite contingent liabilities coming onto the government's books, is the good luck of unexpectedly high inflation, which reduced the real value of the domestic debt, revaluation. And that unexpectedly high inflation was more than enough to pay interest on debt. The average interest rate on debt during that period, calculated very simply by taking the government's interest payments for each fiscal year and dividing it by the stock of debt at the start of the fiscal year, the government's average interest on debt for each year was lower than the rate of inflation, because inflation went up into the mid-teens during this period. So the government was making a profit on debt. This was a factor that was reducing the debt. So the second learning for me and misconception that we can take out of the way is that the government was borrowing to pay debt. Clearly, this situation was not going to continue for very long, where the positive, the benefit of unexpected inflation reduces the value of your domestic debt, the real value of your domestic debt. Lenders to the government are not going to tolerate for long a situation where they are getting paid in interest in real terms, an amount which is less valuable in purchasing power terms compared to the amount that they have lent. So let's look at the situation now just for last year to see how this all went awry. The decomposition for fiscal year 2009-2010, where our debt to GDP ratio rose once again, actually looks quite different from the pattern that was obtained for the previous dozen years. For one thing, the big housekeeping surplus has disappeared. And we had an adverse revaluation because the economy contracted. GDP contracted by about 4% over the year. And so your debt to GDP ratio is going to be 4% higher. But those are not really the big news. The big news is that for the first time in all of this period, debt servicing becomes a problem. It becomes a problem because the interest on debt skyrockets from the 12 to 13% that had obtained before that to 17.5%, based on the fact that the local market has to follow the benchmark rates that were set by the central bank. And the central bank was pursuing a monetary stance, a monetary policy that reflected its own nervousness about the sustainability of the debt, for whatever reason. At the same time that the interest on debt skyrocketed, the inflation rate fell from mid-teens that had obtained before that down to 10%.